This video will contain spoilers for the entirety of Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy XVI is a very difficult game to talk about. Like, where do you even start when talking about Final Fantasy as a series? Those two words hold some weight in the gaming industry. It's a behemoth of a franchise that has been around for over 35 years, with mountains of spin-offs and new entries that hit every year. And through grit and persistence, it has carved out its own space in gaming culture. But Final Fantasy as a brand has been in a very difficult place lately. The releases of 14 and 15 were astronomical for the franchise for different reasons. 15 was a game that was assembled very haphazardly as an attempt to recoup as many costs from Tetsuya Nomura's pet project versus 13. The story was largely unfinished, left to be told by external media like movies and books, and the gameplay left a lot to be desired because of its incredibly simplified nature that just saw the player hold down the attack button throughout the game. 14, on the other hand, was released in an absolutely atrocious state back in 2010. It was a dated mess even at release that thought all it had to do was replicate what Final Fantasy XI did, but it missed the mark by a long shot. The MMO market wasn't in the same place it was back in 2002 when Final Fantasy XI released. The game was a massive failure both commercially and critically, and so they did something that no one had really seen before in the gaming space. They literally nuked the MMO from the gaming landscape and started anew, and to great success. Final Fantasy XIV today is a completely different game than what it once was, and is arguably the one thing keeping company Square Enix afloat during its troubled season. But the scars from 14's 1.0 launch still linger and have long-lasting consequences in how Square Enix operates as a company even today. Square Enix had seen the writing on the walls when it came to their latest entries and had to make a serious change when it came to development. There could not be any more flops for the franchise, and the next mainline release had to be complete from day one, and people had to like it. But it also had to uphold the Final Fantasy brand in a new way. So what better way to do this than to hire the team that brought back the MMO and made it the biggest success the Final Fantasy series has seen since the original 7. Those are some pretty big shoes to fill, but Square Enix had faith that the team behind the MMO's revival, Creative Business Unit 3, had the chops to do it. Making a new mainline Final Fantasy is no easy feat. When you make a mainline entry, you're expected to have magic, crystals, some flavor of Cid, funky hair, and lots of belts. Not to mention that there is a large cultural significance that comes with making a new mainline entry in the series. The last new mainline single-player experience for Final Fantasy was released in 2016, creating a 7-year time gap between these two entries. And let me be clear, when I say new, I'm talking new from the ground up and not a remake. Looking at you, 7.
This sucks.
All this to say that the ever-growing Roman numeral at the end of every title comes with some pretty heavy baggage. Creative Unit 3 took up the mantle of developing Final Fantasy XVI, and to reasonable success. The game launched to a mighty 88% on OpenCritic, and the response to the game has been positive in general, but not all news about the game was positive. There were a few detractors in the review category that weren't too happy with the game for various reasons. It also doesn't seem like Square Enix is too happy with the game either, reporting that the sales for the title, quote, did not meet expectations, end quote. Ouch. And I think I know why. After playing the game once it hit PC earlier in mid-September, I can firmly say that Final Fantasy XVI is just a mediocre game. A mediocre game with an earnest heart. It's a game that plays like an identity crisis that carries a lot of baggage from its developer's history, and I want to take this video to explain why I think that is. But before I do that, if you want to see more long-form analysis videos like this in the future, be sure to click those like and subscribe buttons down below, as it really helps to spread the conversation to more and more people. Now, without further ado, this is Final Fantasy XVI, one of gaming's most passionate messes. In order to begin in earnest, we need to understand what a Final Fantasy game is and isn't. This might be a contentious topic to begin with, but I earnestly believe that it's a crucial element to understanding why Final Fantasy XVI is so mediocre. Final Fantasy as an IP has always been about experimentation. With every new entry, we can see a shakeup occur that both changes what we know about the franchise and changes what it can be moving forward. It's a series about embracing the past while redefining what it means to be a Final Fantasy, whatever that might entail. scale. The developers at Square Enix have never been content to let the series stay stagnant, and it has been this way since the very beginning. It's something that defines the series and makes it stand out from other major JRPGs on the market like Shin Megami Tensei and Dragon Quest. We know that Final Fantasy isn't content with just being a traditional Western fantasy. As the midpoint of the series, we see it take up a more steampunk sci-fi direction, because fantasy isn't strictly Western with fairies and wizards and knights, but also time travel and spaceships and lasers. The series revels in the beauty of fantasy in all of its forms, never content to just be a lazy interpretation of traditional fantasy as we know it today. When we go back to the beginning, we can see these shakeups begin in a pretty tame way. Final Fantasy I released back in 1987 and basically wrote the book on how to make a JRPG. It was an RPG through and through, with stats and a cast of characters of your choice, and an enthralling narrative that saw you traverse through a unique fantasy setting complete with time traveling. With Final Fantasy III, for instance, the series took what made the original entry's classes so unique and made the job system. This would allow the player to change their party's composition to whatever fits their need and playstyle. And with Final Fantasy IV, just one entry later, the series added the active time battle system, which was a blend of turn-based combat and a bar that filled up in real time that, once filled, allowed characters to perform any action. The active time battle system, combined with the job system, would come to define the series for years to come. The series would make small but meaningful changes to both systems as it advanced with every entry, redefining how the combat would feel, but would also put more and more emphasis on the narrative. The narrative was a huge selling point for Final Fantasy from the very beginning, and just grew bigger and more complex. The scale for the games would get bigger and bigger with every entry, always outdoing what the previous one did. Fights were bigger, the music got crazier, the summons were longer. But no matter what, the series stayed an RPG with emphasis on player choice and progression. At the end of the day, every entry was still a Final Fantasy, no matter how much it changed. And true to form, Final Fantasy XVI has everything a Final Fantasy needs to be, well, a Final Fantasy. All the iconography is in check. It's got the magic, it's got the crystals, it has Cid, funky hair, and belts. It has the same monsters one might expect to fight from a classic Final Fantasy. It has your eyeballs, your flans, your behemoths. The combat is also a huge shakeup from traditional games. While not the first mainline entry to do active action combat, it takes everything 15 did wrong and adapts it into a more modern framework, ensuring that the bombast that people know from traditional Final Fantasy combat is here. It tells a sweeping narrative, you still level up, there are still stats, you equip gear, and so on. The game does everything a Final Fantasy game is supposed to do in order to move the franchise forward into bold new territory while giving purpose to that big XVI at the end. But there's a problem. Despite having all of these things, Final Fantasy XVI isn't really a Final Fantasy game at all. In fact, I'd say it's a horrible Final Fantasy. Yes, it has the monsters and the spells and the combat and the belts and crystals and whatever, but it uses them in a way that feels almost antithetical to what Final Fantasy is. Yes, every mainline entry is supposed to push the franchise into bold new directions, but this just feels like too much of a different direction. A direction that makes an effort to give the impression of a Final Fantasy instead of feeling and playing like one, which is why someone would play a Final Fantasy in the first place. And it does a great job at deceiving the player that it can uphold its legacy on appearances alone. In all honesty, Final Fantasy XVI makes some fantastic first impressions. As the game begins, the player is inundated with some of the most fanciful fighting to ever grace a game as these two mythic figures, Phoenix and Ifrit, duke it out for reasons unknown. But who needs a reason when two giant monsters are fighting to the death? Shit's cool as hell. The lighting, effects work, and music are all at full blast, and the game does everything in its power to showcase the technical prowess behind the creative minds over at Square Enix. These guys have been pioneers in the Japanese tech space for decades, always pushing consoles to their limits, and 16 shows you immediately why that is. Shortly after Phoenix and Ifrit finish their scuffle, we are introduced to our leading man for this journey, Clive, as he broods over a small but simmering fire, a fire that burns much like the Phoenix did that fateful night. He's in the middle of an active war Zone, where other mythical figures, Shiva and Titan, are fighting for control over the land for reasons unknown at that time. Soldiers and chocobos perish on the crowded battlefield, blood spills, the violence is catastrophic. This is the first M-rated mainline Final Fantasy, and they really want you to know that within the first 30 minutes of starting it up. And during this first 30 minutes, the game slowly introduces the player into its world and inundates them with lots of information. An exposition dump at the beginning of the game is a bold move, but the game also wants to let you know that it is telling a much more mature story as well, filled with politics, sex, violence, love, and much more nuance than Final Fantasy is usually known for in its narratives. After that bombastic prologue, Clive sustains a head injury and is knocked unconscious. The game uses this as an opportunity to thrust the player back to the past to take up the role of Clive once more, but as a teen during a sparring match with his mentor in his home kingdom of Rosaria. Our mentor runs us through the essentials of combat, all of which will be required during the playthrough. The player learns how to attack, dodge, cast fireballs, and even learn how to use Clive's iconic feat, allowing him to warp to his target instantly. The way combat in 16 plays is very similar to how we've seen it used in Final Fantasy games since 13. You wail on an enemy enough to raise a stagger meter that sits under their health bar. Once the meter is filled all the way, the enemy will enter a state that allows you to dump a massive amount of damage into them. So the more damage you can fit into that window, the better. And the best way to deal damage is by hitting the enemy with your magic abilities. Magic and Final Fantasy are inseparable, but in 16 it serves a unique narrative purpose. See, Clive is what is known in the universe as a bearer, a person blessed with the power from the mother crystals that allow him to cast and conjure magic, and his family lineage was blessed by that of the icon Phoenix. But we come to find out that being a bearer isn't all it's cracked up to be. It's actually quite the stigma to be a bearer. All bearers are branded with a mark on their cheek to denote their curse. These bearers are used as slaves by the rest of the world for their unique magic capabilities. Not to mention, they're also treated lower than dirt. The game does not shy away from telling a complex and mature story about slavery, and we see that on full display just how these people are treated from the start. What is considered a blessing within Clive's royal family is deemed a curse to others outside of that. So there's a double standard to the slavery aspect as well. This will all serve as the framework for the story, as well as establish Clive's motivations going forward, to create a world without magic so no one will inherently be better than anyone else, to make a world that doesn't change how it views you, no matter the circumstances of your birth. Pretty heavy narrative subject matter right from the get-go. We also come to learn of dominance. Clive's brother Joshua is one of these dominants, a type of bearer that is extra special. Dominants hold the ability to manifest the form of their respective elemental icon. So since Joshua is the dominant of fire, he can manifest the Phoenix. So remember that beginning sequence where we saw Phoenix fighting that other fiery figure? Well, we'll get into that in just a bit as we go deeper into the narrative, as well as how all these dominants play into the story and the gameplay. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that I've been setting up a lot of proper nouns already. Rosaria, dominant, mother crystal, bearer, icon. Final Fantasy XVI throws you right into the fire with all of these nouns, expecting you to piece it together using the context you've been given, which can be both a good and a bad thing. It's a literary device that storytellers use that assumes you're smart enough to put the pieces together on your own, learning what a bearer is, what a dominant is, and so on. But the game also does a lot of legwork for the player by giving them access to a thing called active time lore, an interactive document that tells you everything you need to know about the world of Final Fantasy XVI, the nouns it uses, the lore of the world, as well as the characters that inhabit it along with their interpersonal connections. This is a document that gets updated in real time as you progress the game because the world of 16 is not stagnant. It is constantly moving, with pieces moving here and there, and relationships alter and motivations change for characters. This is one of the best things in the game because if you as a player ever feel confused by anything about the game, all you need to do is refer to the active time lore menu by holding down a button, and the game gives you everything you need to know. And to be fair, the game needs it because the world of 16 is complex. There are several kingdoms vying for dominance over the lands of Valistia, all governed by their own people with unique motivations. So having a document to refer back to time and time again if things get maybe a little too hectic is always nice. But I felt that the game did a good enough job explaining everything on its its own, and I didn't need to refer to it that often. It's a major lesson learned after the pathetic release of Final Fantasy XV, where much of the game's narrative and lore was left on the cutting room floor. Players were not given the complete package in terms of what they are fighting for, and the motivations for all of the major characters in the narrative. The active time lore system also takes advantage of the world-building prowess that Creative Unit 3 is known for in their work on Final Fantasy XIV. The world of Valistia is just as reactive and alive as Eorzea, and if you're a 14 player, you know what that means. These guys are top of their game when it comes to world building. Now, putting focus back on the intro, it keeps up its momentum pretty incredibly, never sticking to one story beat for too long. We learn of Clive's unwavering faithfulness to his brother Joshua, serving as his own brother's shield in the face of danger. These two are all but inseparable, but Clive is finally a man capable of handling combat on his own, so his father sets him out to handle some goblins out at a nearby swamp to let him go loose with the skills you just learned. And what a joy it is to finally start playing 16's combat for the first time. The game looks stunning from beginning to end, and it handles like a dream. The first few hours are fantastic and give you a taste of what the rest of your time with 16 will be like. Dynamic, fast, cool, and pretty fun. These are all things you're going to need when a game is going to be over 40 hours long. JRPGs aren't short games, so they need the gameplay chops to sustain that runtime. As the player progresses, they get introduced to abilities and leveling up. You know, classic Final Fantasy staples. When I first saw those stats combined with that combat system, I was pleasantly surprised. It felt like the long-lost sibling to Kingdom Hearts that I've always been waiting for. A responsive and dynamic combat system with lots of room for player expression as the game progressed. And now it's finally in my hands. The combat system plays pretty similar to Kingdom Hearts, but it plays even more similar to something like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. Moves are stylish and pack a serious punch. You can charge your attacks, juggle enemies in the air, shoot projectiles to keep enemies suspended, and more. Pretty crazy to see this kind of combat in a Final Fantasy game, but it's also not the first game to do character action combat in a JRPG framework. Far from it. But what is present in the beginning is enough to give me hope. Hope that the game can reach the highs of other amazing character action games. As the intro comes to a close, Clive's father, the king, is slain along with the rest of his army, slaughtered by an opposing force, effectively eliminating a ruling kingdom from the world overnight. In response to seeing his own father's blood splattered on his face, Joshua takes up the form of the Phoenix. He's uncontrollable and goes on a rampage of uncontrollable emotion. There's nothing that can be done until something happens to Clive. He becomes possessed by something outside of him, and he inhabits the form of the second dominant of fire, Ifrit, which shakes up what we understand about the dominant system. And boom, we are right back to where we started, with the Phoenix and Ifrit plummeting down a gargantuan tunnel, duking it out for survival. Neither force is truly in control, but the brute force of Ifrit is too powerful for Joshua's inexperience at controlling the Phoenix. Ifrit bashes the Phoenix body and crushing it and Joshua to death. It's dramatic, it's brutal, it's anime as hell, and I'll say it, it's cinema. Everything about this intro is perfect because it not only establishes everything we need to know about the world of 16, but also how it plays, as well as the rippling effects of this fateful night as we see Clive at an older age. Now, I know what you're thinking. This guy sure is glazing this game thicker than a Krispy Kreme donut. Why is he calling it a mediocre game then? Well, that's about as far as the positives go for 16. This beautiful, explosive intro would actually be an omen for the rest of the game, because this is about as good as the game was ever going to get. This was the flash in the pan that the rest of the game tries its best to replicate, but just cannot muster anything close to how impressive those first few hours are. It's hard to top your peak, and Final Fantasy XVI's peak is 2 hours into its 40+ hour experience, because the more you play, the more its shortcomings as a Final Fantasy game become apparent. Creative Unit 3 is clearly a very talented game development studio, but they have a very distinct approach to game development. Their games have a unique flavor, almost auteur-like. It's like when you pick up a game by Hideo Kojima, you know what it's going to be. It's going to play well, be very reactive, and have a unique flair that no other games have. Metal Gear is a series defined by Kojima's insanity and attention to detail, and the same could be said about Creative Unit 3's approach to game design. Creative Unit 3 is a team designed to to make an MMO first and foremost. But Final Fantasy XIV isn't your average MMO. It's an MMO where the story takes precedence over everything else in the package. Everything you do in the game is locked behind story progression, and that's what makes it unique in the MMO space. That, and it's very clearly a casual-friendly MMO since the story is the focus rather than the gameplay. These guys have been making the MMO for over 10 years at this point, so needless to say that they know how to make a good MMO. And that is to say, they know how to make a game easy to pick up and play while you turn your brain off, while you enjoy the narrative wrapping of the experience. The player can pick any class, wander around at their own pace, enjoy the story, get carried by players better than them, and still see the game's fantastic narrative play out with the player taking an active role. It's brain off game design for the average Final Fantasy XIV player, and Creative Unit 3 has had immense success making the game this way. They somehow found a working formula that made the MMO genre accessible. The game was simple enough for anyone to enjoy, and it's clearly good enough to have millions of people pay for a sub to play the game every year. The team had developed a proven track record of some of the best review scores out of all of the Final Fantasy games released in the past decade. Of course they deserve their own shot at developing their own mainline single-player entry, but the problems start there. See, when you're working on MMOs, you get really good at a few things. Those things are world building, quest writing, dungeons, raids, crafting systems, and many others. But I would argue that the one thing MMOs aren't great at is gameplay. The standards for an MMO and standards for a single-player Final Fantasy game are so incredibly different. MMOs have a very unique flow that many people just don't jive with, so it takes a certain type of player to get into it. The way 14 gets around this is to make all of the classes in the game fairly easy to play from level 1, giving the player just a handful of spells and slowly giving them new ones as they level up and progress through the narrative, because story is paramount in Creative Unit 3 games. Gameplay will always be secondary, and that development philosophy carries over to 16 in all of the worst ways. While the game makes a great first impression, it follows it in a lot of the gameplay footsteps that 14 does, despite being a completely different genre. The game starts fairly simple in terms of combat sandbox. Like I mentioned earlier, you have your attack, your fireball, your dodge, your iconic feat, as well as 2 abilities per icon that you acquire. And you are going to be using these abilities for a long time, because there is very little that gets added to the game after this point. Since it's an action game, you would expect to get new combos or moves to mix into your repertoire in order to deal more damage or even get more XP for more stylish gameplay, and then subsequently spend that XP to unlock even more combos that buff your basic moveset as you play. But there's nothing of the sort here. The moves you have at level 5 are going to be the same moves you use at level 45, with no deviation in how you use them. The only thing that gets added to the combat sandbox that you can experiment and have fun with are the new icons that you absorb from other dominants. The game takes forever to introduce you to these new iconic abilities because, just like 14, all of these goodies are tied to story progression. You'll be spending a solid 5 to 6 hours before you get access to your second set of abilities through Garuda, and another 5 hours after that to get your third set. At max, you will only be able to wield 6 abilities at a time. When the player does fill all of their slots, that's about as complex as the game will ever get. So better get comfortable using those 6 abilities. You will become very accustomed to them. But in order to be fully charitable, each icon you absorb gets a total of 3 abilities that you can swap in and out. 2 normal ones and 1 ultimate ability on a longer cooldown. All of these abilities have their own stat distribution, so some abilities are better at staggering and others are better at burst damage. And all of the abilities also have their own function in combat. Some block projectiles, some can launch enemies, and some just do a massive amount of burst damage. Talking about stats, it's another terrible thing that Creative Unit 3 decided to carry over to 16. Final Fantasy XIV makes it a point to minimize the importance of stats and leveling up because that's not the primary draw of the game. As long as you're the right level for a boss fight or raid, you're basically set. The stats in 16 are very similar, where they feel almost cosmetic. Sure, you level up and numbers get higher, but the impact of those stats as they increase is microscopic at best. There is no noticeable difference in how you play early game and the end game. Your attacks may kill a lower level enemy in one swing less, but you can walk up and challenge bosses that are much higher level than you with little to no consequence because of how watered down stats are in the game. You could argue that it makes the game much more skill focused, but if anything, it's also much less punishing than it should be. I shouldn't just be able to mosey up to an S tier hunt monster that's 10 levels higher than me, and I can survive by just spamming the dodge button because there's no cooldown and the timing is incredibly generous. There is no skill in that. It just means that any fight is doable at any level as long as you have the time and patience. Now, to their credit, Creative Unit 3 knows how to make a decent boss fight. The boss fights in 16 take a lot of influence from 14's bosses in terms of mechanics. Lots of ground-based AoEs, lots of positional awareness, and some decent execution to get out of sticky situations. The boss fights are without a doubt the best thing about 16, and that's one thing you will hear everybody say about the game no matter what. They're flashy, explosive, larger than life, and anime as hell, and that's what I love about them. The Titan fight in particular, when both Ifrit and Titan are both falling down the pit and Ifrit uses Titan's abilities just because it's cool at that moment. Rule of cool trumps anything when it comes to the kaiju battles. The fights are spectacular even if they are just glorified playable cutscenes with some quicktime events that a toddler could do. But I think that condenses down what I don't like about the combat system, even the boss fights. A toddler could play this. There is no challenge, there are no stakes in any encounter, and there is simply no incentive to play better or even combo because you don't get anything good for your performance. Even in the action mode, I never had a moment during my playthrough where I felt remotely challenged at any point. Every encounter whittles down to hitting an enemy with your stagger abilities until the bar fills, watch them collapse, then dump literally all of your abilities into them until they get back up, and then repeat until the fight ends. And no fight is ever truly unique because enemies only come in a handful of archetypes: foot soldier, small flyers, medium-sized creature without a stagger bar, and then larger enemies with a stagger bar. Sure, there's a decent amount of variety in these enemies, but none of them perform any differently from other units in any substantial way. It's like they're all just reskins of models that came before. The game does do an interesting thing about halfway through, allowing the caster variants of foot soldiers to cast heal, protect, and bravery on melee units, requiring you to change up your gameplay a bit to deal with these added layers of combat. I think all of them are good, but my favorite one is protect because it actually forces you to use your abilities on certain enemies in order to break their defense. And there's a really satisfying crash whenever you do that. It's a lovely mechanic that utilizes the basics of the combat system and actually requires the player to turn on their brain after they've been spamming the square button for 20 hours. Another one I like is the spell introduced in the Echoes of the Fallen DLC, which allows an enemy caster to buff an enemy with a damaging shield that can only be dispelled by a few hits from your standard projectile, which actually gives some use to the damn thing. It hits like a wet noodle for the whole game, but finally finds a purpose in this DLC. Too bad it's only in the DLC and we don't see it anywhere else because it's literally at the fucking end of the game. These enemy buffs are a good way to add depth to a combat system that is sorely lacking it, but these buffs are used both too little and too late into the experience to make any substantial impact. There are other things I could talk about in the combat system, like the limit break system that lets Clive enter a devil trigger type mode, letting him do faster, more damaging attacks, or how you can use your puppy pal Torgal to assist you in fighting enemies, or even how if you hit a parry, then your abilities come off of cooldowns faster, but none of it matters. None of it truly does matter in the slightest because no matter how flashy and impactful the combat might be, it's missing the one element it needs to be truly amazing, and that's fun. The enjoyment I had with 16 combat was wearing thin after just a few hours because I was doing the exact same thing with no deviation the entire time. Hit enemy, stagger, dump abilities, repeat. And it goes that way with every single encounter, including boss fights. And it makes me really sad because it makes me think of what could have been. I've played games that have released many years before with combat so much more in depth and much more enjoyable, but this game with this absurd budget just doesn't even bother to make it worth playing. And it's all in service to reach that mass market appeal that Creative Unit 3 is really known for. I mean, if they can do it with their MMO, why can't they do it with a mainline single-player Final Fantasy game? And well, the answer couldn't be more obvious. People have different expectations when playing MMOs than they do when playing a single-player JRPG. It's this aversion to depth and gameplay nuance that is sorely lacking from these developers, almost like they think the player is a moron who can't understand nuance in stat numbers, what those numbers mean, how to learn new moves to weave into their combo, and so much more. Like, dude, Kingdom Hearts 2 did it 18 years before you did. This isn't something new or original for Final Fantasy, it's just bad. And one more thing about the combat in 16. The Final Fantasy series has had this strange aversion to turn-based combat for almost a decade now. I get it, it's current year. People don't want to play turn-based games anymore. Except what I just said is an absolute lie. People still love turn-based RPGs, as we've seen with the success of the Persona series, Baldur's Gate 3, and even the latest Atlas release, Metaphor ReFantazio. People will always play a turn-based RPG if they think it will be good enough. So why aren't Final Fantasy games going back to their roots and sticking with what made it popular in the first place? Well, in an interview with Good Luck Have Fun, Yoshi P, producer for Final Fantasy XVI and director of Final Fantasy XIV, said the following, quote, "I want to let everyone know we're really not against turn-based games. We're fans of them too, but for the story we wanted to tell, the look of the game and the feeling of dynamic non-stop action felt best suited to the story and what we wanted players to feel. We decided turn-based or a mix of turn-based with action that interrupts the flow, it didn't feel right. Having played and worked on Final Fantasy XIV, it's given me the opportunity to travel around the world meeting fans and journalists and talking about the game and Final Fantasy in general. From speaking with so many fans as well as a lot of research we conducted about Final Fantasy, we have a good idea of what people think about the series, what they like, what they don't like, and what they want to see more of. With Final Fantasy XVI, I wanted to create a game that would appeal to FF fans and a broader audience, and that a wider range of gamers from different generations would be happy to play," end quote. And like, it couldn't be any clearer. They made 16 with the purpose of appealing to as many people as possible, which, as we all know, isn't really the best way to make games these days. It's like they made a game for a market instead of actual players, just like they do with 14. They removed the special sauce that makes a Final Fantasy game what it should be, and that is a fun, traditional turn-based experience with a twist. I'm not saying that Final Fantasy needs to be turn-based, but I think that people generally know that the best Final Fantasy games are the ones that are turn-based experiences. They're games that allow players to experiment with multiple layered party compositions that fit whatever play style they want, with trade-offs and benefits to each one. And while it's not traditionally turn-based, the active time battle system was this great middle ground of making an action combat system and a turn-based one. And that's what's fun about them. Not to mention the change in tone of the new game as well, and what a drastic turn it is for the series as a whole. Final Fantasy is known for their unique, interesting stories with so many fun and lovable characters, and there are few of them here in this title. And the game doesn't spend much time working on these characters either, because they serve very little purpose in and out of combat. The series, well known for its interesting playable party members, has been sanded down far too much with 16. The player is only able to control Clive throughout the journey, but I can understand the reasoning behind it. As you progress, Clive gets access to these iconic abilities that we've been talking about, and with every new dominant that Clive absorbs, that is a set of 3 new abilities to play with. I think the developers were worried that the player would become too overwhelmed if they had to control a second party member like Jill or Sid, because that means learning a whole new set of moves. They were more worried that some dad who can only game 2 hours a night would get too confused by this already simple combat system adding anything new and would drop the game. If anything, the omission of other playable party members actually has the opposite effect. I wanted to see what else the game had in store for me, and getting 2 new abilities on my hotbar every 5 or so hours that required I swap out old ones, it just wasn't doing it for me. The game needs other characters to play as. Clive can only do so much with his limited repertoire of combos and abilities, and adding a second fully fleshed out character with an alternate moveset would benefit the game greatly, not only in terms of gameplay, but for those who seek mastery over the game's simple combat system. Let me use Joshua as an example. During the intro of the game, we get to play as him during a short stint, watching him utilize some pretty crazy magical spells even at a young age. But when we make it deeper into the story, we discover that he survived his dangerous encounter with Ifrit and has been on a journey of his own. The game could use this opportunity to let us play as Joshua at an older age, just like Clive, swapping between the two characters with their own unique move sets. While Clive has access to a wide assortment of other iconic abilities, Joshua could show his prowess with magic and casting in ways you wouldn't see when playing as Clive. Kind of like how Devil May Cry lets you play between Dante and Virgil in different playthroughs. Just some food for thought. What is in the game is the bare minimum in terms of combat. It's an incredibly strange aversion to any sort of gameplay depth that ruins the experience, because once you see it, it doesn't change after that. It doesn't push the series forward. In fact, it sets it back decades. When a literal children's game from 2002 has more in-depth, complex combat than you, I think it's time to reevaluate why you're making the game play like this in the first place. God damn, that was a lot of talking about combat, huh? Well, lucky for us, this is a Final Fantasy game. That means there's going to be a lot of other things to do in our spare time. I can't wait to see what the overarching minigame for this game is. I wonder if it plays anything like Triple Triad or Tetramaster, or maybe there's a Golden Saucer equivalent. That would be fantastic. Final Fantasy games always have fun stuff to do, as well as minigames throughout that help break up the pacing. Well, except for this one, I guess, because Final Fantasy XVI is pretty much just combat and just quests and nothing else. No minigames, no diversions, no fishing, there's fucking nothing. So I hope you like walking around empty zones, going from quest marker to quest marker, listening to pointless side quest dialogue that does very little to grow your investment in the story, because that's all you get, baby. Just like Final Fantasy XIV. Oh my god. The game adopts another wonderful trend from 14, and by wonderful, I'm being completely facetious. I'm talking, of course, about the needless padding. Holy God, is it really bad here? Atrociously bad even. When Creative Unit 3 designs a narrative, they love to flesh it out. Fair enough. They want to make sure that you're getting a fully realized world filled with nuanced character writing that gets you invested in every little detail. And that means making you do quests that involve you talking to people that need their problems solved, no matter how small. Final Fantasy XVI is capable of doing this world building through quest design and narrative padding, but its success rate is astronomically low. The reason for this is because there are only a handful of characters that you interact with consistently in the narrative. Cid, Jill, Joshua, then all of these side characters who I cannot for the life of me remember the names of, but they're just regular people. Boring ass people with no narrative weight whatsoever. Most of these characters are only in the narrative to serve one purpose, and that purpose is to give Clive these stupid little insignias for each area of the world that says, yeah, this guy's chill, he can hang out. So you spend the majority of your time out of combat doing errand work for these cardboard cutout characters, picking up garbage, talking to other milquetoast NPCs, collecting herbs and shit, and turning in said herbs and shit to get a pittance of a reward. The most you'll get out of these quests is a little XP and a handful of gil. A handful of gil that serves no purpose because the only thing you buy in the game are new weapons that deal slightly more damage and stagger than your previous one, along with pieces of armor that do nothing but raise your defense stat by 1 or 2. The accessories are almost even more damning because all they do is lower one ability's cooldown by a few seconds or up their damage by a handful of percentage points. I know buildcraft isn't a major part of character action games, but like, give me something to work with here, guys, because when equipment doesn't matter and leveling doesn't matter, then that means questing doesn't matter either. There's no point to it other than to waste your time and feel like you didn't waste your money buying the game. The questing experience wouldn't be as bad as it is if Clive could move faster than a light jog on a Sunday afternoon. He has one speed in hubs, and that speed is that of a 63-year-old retiree who's been taking up speed walking because it's what his doctor said he needed to do to live another 5 years. Here, take a look. I've sped up this gameplay to show you how bad this shit can get. Here is me strolling from NPC to NPC, trying to make a little game out of it. What route can I take to talk to every single quest giver in this area in as little time as possible? God, it's bad. It's so bad. Now detractors might be saying, at least it's kind content. My man, content on its own isn't inherently good. Have you seen Ubisoft games lately? A game that pads its playtime with meaningless fluff isn't worth my time, or anyone's time for that matter. The game could use a substantial trim to get this fluff out, and it would have been a much tighter experience all around because of it. But that's the Final Fantasy name cracking the whip behind the scenes. It has to be a 40-hour long story, so there has to be enough content to justify those 40 hours. I guess it's a good thing that the story does a decent enough job at justifying its length, even if there's about 20 hours worth of padding in there. Yes, the gameplay of Final Fantasy XVI might be dog water, but I found the narrative theming and wrapping of the game to be quite engaging for the most part. It's kind of like a roller coaster in a way. After every major story beat that peaks, the game will come back down to the valley to set up the next peak. Pretty basic story structure stuff. There's rising action, climaxes punctuated by kaiju fights with other dominants, and the falling action to set up the next major story event. But man, the valleys from the falling action are deep. You're going to feel on top of the world after you walloped a dragon in space with the power of God and anime on your side. I mean, how could you not? Shit's divine. Chef's kiss even. But the joke's on you though, because your ass has to do grocery shopping right after every single one of these major boss fights. But that juxtaposition from being a god-slaying wielder of fire to going straight back to being an errand boy made me think, were these major dips in the narrative, all these errands, the lulls of the story, were they needed? And I think to a certain extent that they were. I mean, you can't have those massive highs without massive lows to go with it, because those lows make you appreciate the highs even more. The game rides this line of boring, meaningless tedium and Dragon Ball-esque battles so brilliantly that it makes the player think that the experience is actually pretty good. It makes the player think that these kaiju battles are worth playing the game for, and there is merit in that. But in my opinion, they are just band-aid solutions for a game that desperately needed something to sell. The game needed spectacle. It needed to showcase the power of the PS5. What better way to do that than to make two beings of immense strength clash over these massive battlefields? But again, it's all surface level. These battles, no matter the scale, big or small, offer nothing of substance to the experience other than spectacle. There is no consequence to failure or poor performance because the game picks you back up with full inventory if you do die. And checkpoints are plentiful. There are no stakes within the gameplay itself, only the narrative. The narrative, through all its twists and turns, is actually pretty good. Like I mentioned before, it has some great highs and devastating lows, but that's what makes it the narrative it is. We see Clive turn from boy to man, fighting to liberate a world and free it from the clutches of magic, to free the world from an artificial caste system that created a double standard, where the people wielding the magic are actually worth less than those who can't. It's an interesting inversion of the traditional narrative trope where people gifted with magical abilities are often seen as heroes and savior figures within fantasy narratives, and Clive succeeded in his journey to rid the world of magic, as well as discover himself along the way as he beats the shit out of other giant monsters. He learns that it's okay to ask for help, to not shoulder the burden of his goals on his own, and that part spoke to me. I think it's a thing that a lot of men in particular can relate to. Men are often taught that asking for help can be seen as a sign of weakness, but it's really quite the opposite. Asking for help and accepting help from others is a sign of maturity and compassion, and Clive comes to learn that by the end of the narrative as he comes to trust those around him. They depend on him, and he depends on them. The overall plot of ridding the world of magic and establishing a world without a caste system mostly hits, but kind of flops at the end as the narrative wanders away from the idea of the caste system altogether and reveals that there is a higher being pulling the strings behind the scenes the whole time. Ultima. He is the one who created humanity and gave them magic as a way to power himself. So a god creating and ruling over humans is like a second form of a caste system. Are you seeing the parallels? It's like we're slaves to our gods, man. That's incredibly deep, like George Lucas said.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
But no one ever said the Japanese were subtle storytellers, and that can be part of their charm. In good old JRPG fashion, it's more important to kill the god than to solve the problem. But the ends justify the means, and killing Ultima does eventually rid the world of magic. However, the ending doesn't really feel like Clive's efforts are even important, as the dismantling of the caste system and the corrupt governments now plays second fiddle to killing a god. We never see the positive consequences of his hard work, leaving leaving it all open-ended. Overall, the message is solid, if lackluster. The destruction of the caste system underlying Clive's motivations doesn't say anything truly meaningful other than slavery bad, we are all equals. It loses itself in order to up the stakes, and the more you prod at the inconsistencies of the narrative, it doesn't make much sense. But nothing put under a lot of scrutiny tends to hold up very well. I guess to wrap that up, I'll say it's good, if decent at worst. It made the game tolerable, but I really wish the game wasn't just tolerable. After years and years of playing Final Fantasy XIV, I know from the bottom of my heart that these developers cared about making games. 14 isn't just a game to them, it's their baby, and has been since 1.0 was nuked. They've spent a decade rebuilding it from the ground up to make it not only a game in its own right, but a cultural phenomenon. It's one of gaming's greatest underdog stories, and those same people worked on Final Fantasy XVI, a game made by some of the best and brightest in the gaming industry without a doubt. Square Enix and their developers are world class for a reason. They've been making games for over 35 years, and their legacy and output are simply second to none. These guys poured their hearts and souls into every crevice of the game, and it's plain as day to see this. It feels fantastic to play. It animates beautifully. It looks gorgeous, sounds great. It has some of the best written prose you'll find in the gaming industry. There is passion here. No doubt about it. The game is dripping in it. It's such a thoughtfully crafted experience, both narrative and gameplay wise, and it leaves no stone unturned and gives you a full product. A game with a beginning, middle, and end, and that looks and plays great the entire time. But sometimes passion just isn't enough. Passion just means you're dedicated to the cause and mean to always put your best foot forward into your endeavors. The team wanted to put together a product that wouldn't just be enjoyed by traditional fans of Final Fantasy, but people of every skill level. There is merit in that approach. It shows an earnestness that you don't see from many developers these days, but it's that goal that led them down the path to making a game that's about as exciting as a piece of white bread. It's great for everybody, but it's going to be plain as hell. It's a great framework, but it needs some fucking meat on it. And that's what happens when you develop for mass market appeal. You lose what makes the game so special in the first place in order to placate as many people as possible. You water down the experience until those that came to your series in the first place feel alienated. And that's why Final Fantasy XVI fails, because it betrays what it means to be Final Fantasy. It's more concerned in wanting to be liked instead of being liked for what it already is. A game and a series that pushes the boundaries of what it can be. A series that takes risks with every new entry. A series that wants to be the best it can be with every new entry. And it's sad to see the franchise as storied as this take it so many L's in a row, both in sales and outreach. But I hope Square Enix is starting to learn their lesson that making games for everybody just isn't the right approach anymore. I wanted to like 16. I really did. I love 14 for all of its faults, so I had faith that the goats at Creative Unit 3 could create a modern masterpiece, but they didn't, and that's fine. People other than myself can still love Final Fantasy XVI with their whole being, and I wish nothing but the best for those people. These are people that recognize the faults with the game, but still love it despite all of those shortcomings. That's true passion right there. And if you like Final Fantasy XVI, don't let anything I've said dissuade you into disliking it like I do. Like what you like. No one can take that from you. I'm passionate about Final Fantasy XVI as well. That's why I made this video. I can see why some people like it, but I think it's also important that we take a critical lens to things we love sometimes. That way we can learn why we love things as well as dislike them. No one goes out to make a bad game, and I know the developers over at Creative Unit 3 wanted to make the best damn thing they could ever make. That's what makes 16 such an interesting thing to critique, because you can see little tidbits of what could have been under the surface. There are the makings of a great game here, but it just needs more to really send it over the finish line. It's a messy game with a lot of love. Misguided love, but love nonetheless. And even if it's not a true Final Fantasy game, that love is what sets it apart from every other entry in the franchise. Carrying that XV and I is a hard task, and I think the team at Creative Unit 3 did the best they could. And that's something to be proud of. but that's just what I think. Please let me know what you think about Final Fantasy XVI in the comments section below. Did you like it more than I did? What were your favorite icon fights? I'm super excited to see what people have to say about the game because it's such an interesting thing to examine. I'd also like to take a moment to thank my channel members listed here. These fine folks help to financially support the channel, letting me continue doing what I love. An extra special thanks goes to my $3 channel members who are Cilantro and The Wendigot. If you would like to help me just like these people listed here, you can also become a channel member down below by clicking the join button right next to the like and subscribe buttons. Final Fantasy XVI was such a massive undertaking, but I'm glad I have it wrapped up. Now to finally tackle Diablo 4 Vessel of Hatred. It's been a long time coming, but I want to give it a deep dive and see how the game has changed because of the expansion. I'll take my time to put the video together, so it'll probably be 2 or 3 weeks. Keep an eye on that sub feed for when it does launch, as new videos always release on Mondays. YouTube seems to think you'll like these videos, so why not check them out? And as always, this has been Testing Triangles. Thanks for watching.